1908 brought a series of dramatic developments which must at least have eased the pain. That April, there was a change of occupant at number 10 Downing Street. Campbell Bannerman was seriously ill, he was forced to resign, and he was replaced as Prime Minister by Herbert Asquith, the Chancellor. And his first job was to find a new occupant for the house that he had just vacated. Number 11 Downing Street, official residence of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And who did he choose? Well, David Lloyd George, despite the fact that the men had a bit of a tricky and volatile relationship. But he recognised Lloyd George's brilliance. And what followed was the most daring and successful chancellorship of modern times. Lloyd George was to stay at number 11 for a period of 8 years. Morning.
Good morning.
I've come to see the Chancellor.
Come in.
Thank you very much. Only two Chancellors have held the job for a greater length of time. William Gladstone back in the 19th century, and the man who's lived here at number 11 since 1997, Gordon Brown. I knew that he had a very high regard for his Liberal predecessor, so I arranged to meet for a brief chat.
We'll just come in here and just have a look. That's the Lloyd George portrait.
Oh, it's wonderful.
It's a great portrait. You see all the papers around, and it's obviously after he was Prime
Done
Minister.
in the 20s,
Yeah, but very impressive.
Why are you an admirer of Lloyd George?
Because he was a dynamic force. I think someone who took risks, was incredibly powerful in pushing things forward, worked on the basis if you have a good idea, you really push it forward. Someone said he took a leap in the dark and then took another leap, and that's really how I think he saw politics. A lot of risks. When I went into the Treasury, Lloyd George had published a document, We Can Conquer Unemployment. And on the document, the Treasury Permanent Secretary of the day had written, at the time it was published, I think 1929, had written 3 words: inflation, extravagance, bankruptcy. And they rejected Lloyd George's proposals. But everybody knows, Keynesian economics that followed, that these were the right proposals. I think he was an incredibly creative force, and to be able to create something from nothing, which is what was happening in the 1906 to 1914 Liberal government, was a tremendous success, and it will not be surpassed by anybody.
Thank you, Roland.
What Lloyd George did as Chancellor was to launch an all-out attack on the social injustice that had offended him since he was a boy. He was determined to improve the lives of Britain's most impoverished people, and he started with one group whose neglect couldn't be denied: the elderly. Unlike some other countries in Europe, Britain at that time had no system of old age pensions. Lloyd George now put that right.
The 5 shillings a week pension for the over 70s sounds pitiful for us today, but it made a difference. I do recall talking to a very old man who remembers his grandfather receiving the money and going on, and he said to his grandfather, "You talk about as if Lloyd George was Jesus Christ and is going to send you to heaven." And the answer was, well, perhaps he won't do that, but he's making the waiting room much more comfortable. The idea of 5 shillings a week, when otherwise it would have been starvation. It was an enormous breakthrough.
So the revolution had started. The Old Age Pensions Act was the most radical measure seen in Britain for many, many years. But Lloyd George wasn't going to stop with pensions. He wanted to help the sick and the unemployed. How on earth was the Chancellor going to pay for all that? Well, he could raise import duties. Trouble is, that would hit the very people he was trying to help, namely the poor. So there was only one answer. Direct taxes would have to go up. Way up. And that was a crucial decision, a turning point for Lloyd George and for the entire country. And the stage was set for one of the greatest political confrontations in British history, the battle over the People's Budget of 1909. The budget speech absorbed Lloyd George's energy for several days. Unlike practically any other speech he gave in his life, he wrote it down carefully and read it out later word for word. Possibly as a result, it wasn't his most inspiring performance. But the importance and the impact of the speech were immense.
In this country, we have already made provision for the aged over 70
All we now have to do to keep ourselves on a level with Germany is to make some further provision for the sick, for the invalided, for widows and orphans.
To say that the speech was radical doesn't begin to tell the story. Income tax went up significantly, death duties went up, there were two entirely new sources of revenue, taxing the ownership of land and a super tax on the very rich. And all of this was delivered in a pretty dry, matter-of-fact kind of way until near the end of the speech, when the Chancellor suddenly switched and made a powerful moral case.
This is a war budget. It is to wage implacable warfare on poverty and squalidness. I cannot help hoping and believing that before this generation has passed away, we shall have advanced a great step towards that good time when poverty and the wretchedness and human degradation that always follow in its camp will be as remote to the people of this country as the wolves which once infested its forests. I commend this budget to the House.
Most members of the House of Commons, including some Tories, reacted favourably to Lloyd George's plans. But they got a very different reaction elsewhere, especially in what they call the other place. Just imagine the anger, the sheer resentment, and the sense of panic, quite frankly, which spread along these red leather benches in the magnificent House of Lords when the members realised what the people's budget was all about. Britain's richest landowners, the hereditary peers, were about to be landed with the biggest tax bill of all time. And guess what? They weren't very happy about it. But they did have the constitutional power to stop Lloyd George in his tracks. The question was, would they dare? Their lordships knew that rejecting the budget would trigger the biggest constitutional crisis Britain had seen since the Glorious Revolution of 1688. As they tried to summon up the courage to take this enormous step, Lloyd George turned up the heat by making two of the boldest speeches of his entire career. The first was delivered at Limehouse in London's East End in July 1909.
Provision for the aged and the deserving poor. Is it not time that something was done? There are many in this country blessed by Providence with great wealth. And if there are amongst them men who grudge out of their riches a fair contribution towards the less fortunate of their fellow countrymen, they are very shabby rich men.
The speech caused uproar in the press. But uncompromising as it was little more than a curtain raiser for the even more provocative attack which Lloyd George unleashed a few months later in Newcastle.
Let them realise what they're doing. They are forcing a revolution, and they will get it. The Lords may decree a revolution, but it is the people who will direct it. If they begin, issues will be raised that they little dream of. The question will be asked whether 500 men, ordinary men, chosen accidentally from amongst the unemployed, should override the judgment, the deliberate judgment of millions of people who are engaged in the industry that makes the wealth of the country.
Did all this constitute a class war? Some people thought it did, not least King Edward VII.
Oh, the king thought that he was a wild man. He compared him to the Jacobins during the French Revolution, and he felt that, he even doubted Lloyd George's sanity at one time. And Lloyd George didn't mind. I mean, he had no particular regard for the king or for monarchs in general. He wanted to win. He wanted to get his budget through. He wanted, above all, to have a platform for social reform.
The view from the throne was bang on. This was class war. And Lloyd George, the people's champion, was determined to win. He had no time for the aristocracy at all. He wanted to confront them, and he wanted to make them pay more tax. And everyone in this House of Lords knew that he wasn't bluffing. So they braced themselves, and they rejected his budget. And for the first time in 200 years, Parliament was in crisis. The battle dragged on for months. No one knew who was going to win, Commons or Lords. And to try to end the crisis, Herbert Asquith called a snap election. That's when things finally started to move. Members of the House of Lords decided, very wisely, that they'd push things to the limit. So they withdrew the veto, and at last, the people's budget passed into law, which was good news for Lloyd George, and even better news for the working class, who'd benefit from all the extra money. But Lloyd George's battle with the House of Lords wasn't over. He wanted bigger change, and they were standing in the way. What he needed was a truly radical solution. The death of King Edward VII in May 1910 would change everything for Lloyd George and for Asquith. Edward had been a staunch defender of the status quo. His successor and son, George V, was known to be more flexible. The two politicians put to him a simple plan for bringing the Lords into line, and he agreed to put it into effect. The new king made it very clear. Unless the House of Lords agreed to limit their own powers, he would create dozens of new peers who would force through in any case. Well, faced with that kind of pressure, the Lords just caved in. And the Parliament Act of 1911 came into force. It's still being used to this day. Never again would the upper house be able to overpower the elected chamber. Free at last from aristocratic opposition, Lloyd George now had the chance he needed to make life better for millions of people in Britain who were either sick or unemployed. Working with his friend Winston Churchill, a left-leaning liberal at that time, he drew up the blueprint for one of the most important pieces of legislation ever seen in Britain, the National Insurrance Act of 1911.
Crucially important act, and which still survives in its broad principles. And it created a comprehensive system of health insurance, and it also had a limited area of national unemployment insurance. And that was very much Lloyd George's work, and it probably was his most important contribution to British social policy.
What particularly impresses some historians today is the cunning way in which Lloyd George funded the scheme, avoiding the cruder methods that politicians of other parties would probably have relied on.
Conservatives would have gone for protection. That was the policy that they were offering, and that would have meant the poor would have paid more on their food. With the Labour Party, it would have been direct taxation. Lloyd George only takes pensions out of direct taxation. Everything else is insurance, i.e. everybody pays in, the employer, the worker and the state. Now that is a middle way, to quote a certain Tony Blair.
Knowing little and no doubt caring even less about the details of the scheme, the public responded very warmly. But not everyone was on side.
One must bear in mind that a large section of the working class had already insured themselves through people like the Pearl and the Prudential, and through friendly societies. And the great enemy of Lloyd George in 1911 was the man from the Prue, who went to half the houses and said, don't vote for that fella, because, of course, if there was state insurance, they might stop paying the brew. And, of course, the other attack came from ladies, grand Tory ladies, who were expected to stick stamps in little booklets for their servants at the behest of Lloyd George. The thing was a total horror for them. And indeed, there were occasions in the Albert Hall when the orchestra might play up, say, the Men of Harlech, where the entire aristocratic audience would hiss because it was their way of saying they didn't like Lloyd George.
Well, despite the toffs' distaste, the National Insurance Act is widely seen today as Lloyd George's greatest achievement. Taken in conjunction with his introduction of old age pensions, it marks him out as one of the key innovators in British political history.
The idea is that Lloyd George and his radical colleagues in that very important progressive Edwardian liberal government that they set out to do and actually achieved did set much of the agenda for British political parties for the next 50 or 60 years. The experiments, as Lloyd George himself would have recognised them, of health and unemployment insurance, of old age pensions, reached their culmination in the arrival of the welfare state in 1945 and afterwards.
It was a huge shift from the Victorian way of thinking, which was all about self-help, to the 20th century way of looking at social problems and saying that, well, there are people out there who are suffering through no fault of their own. Surely the state ought to use its income to create some kind of safety net for these people. And Lloyd George is absolutely crucial in that great political intellectual shift.
By 1912, Lloyd George had a place in history as one of the prime architects of a more civilized society.